So, Hegel introduces this notion of logical life, as he calls it, on 677. And he opposes it there to natural life from the philosophy of nature and spiritual life, the life of the spirit, from the philosophy of spirit. And, if you let that go for the moment, or if you kind of let him say, okay, well, I got this logical sense of life, and you don't press him about it terribly much, you might think, well, that's okay. But then when you go on into the chapter and you look at what he calls the life process, it does have, as I mentioned before the break, this structure of sensibility, irritability, and reproduction. So, I always think about this when we get, and we will get there today or next session, and talk about reproduction, right? What really doesn't belong in the logic is the logic of reproduction, maybe, right? Because what's it doing here, right? But this is part of what he claims is the life process. So in that sense, the logical life certainly looks a lot like natural life. Sensibility, irritability, those are recognizable features of natural organisms. So is reproduction. And insofar as it culminates in reproduction, and this is a big if, you may not think it's a big if when you read through it, but I think it's a big if, whether that reproduction is sexual or not, right? If it is sexual, then it's got maybe intersubjective relationships built into it. Then it looks to be maybe equatable with spiritual life as well. So this looks like a problem all around, this notion of logical life. And Hegel does recognize that because he wants to say, well, that I've got to distinguish it from these other forms of natural life and spiritual life. So what is the logical sense of life? Well, I take you back to this notion of where he says it's the purpose within objectivity that generates objectivity. That's what he's established, right? So that's the most minimal thing he means by life is that. The purpose within objectivity that generates objectivity itself. That last bit's incredibly important. It's not just that it's the purpose within objectivity. It is that. But it's the purpose within objectivity that generates objectivity. And then he's added to that, he's elaborated on that, built upon that, this notion of what he calls the urge, the trieb, right? The urge, the impulse to differentiate. So as he says and he recalls this, on page 678, this is 181 in the German. Let's see where it's. Sorry. Yeah. So this is 678. A little further than halfway down the page, just after the hyphen there. But this simple life is not only omnipresent. Everybody see where I'm at? But this simple life is not only omnipresent. And he writes, he's talking about the life qua this immanent purpose. That's what he's been talking about. That's what he means by omnipresence. It's everywhere. It's literally throughout objectivity itself. He says, this life as immanent Zweck, is impulse, it's true. More precisely, the specific impulse of particular difference, so there's the impulse to differentiate, to particularize itself. And no less essentially the one and universal impulse of the specific that leads its particularization back to unity and holds it there. So there's that whole process of universalizing, particularizing itself into singularity. Only as this negative unity of its objectivity and particularization is life self-relating, life that exists for itself, a soul, as he calls it. As such, that is, as a soul, it is essentially a singular that relates to objectivity as to an other in inanimate nature. So there's the relationship of soul to inanimate nature. You could say the organic to the inorganic if we were in the natural realm. That's not where we are. He then calls it the originary judgment, right? The Urteil, right? The opening up, the separation of life consists therefore in this, that it separates itself off as individual subject from the objective world, and since it constitutes itself as the negative unity of the concept, it makes the presupposition of an immediate objectivity. It generates its own objectivity. Right, so there's the status of the concept qua idea, now the concept qua idea as minimally defined as life. And then he says, that means you can contrast it with natural life and spiritual life. Well, you want to say, how so? Well, in terms of natural life, this is back on 677 now, right? So I'm backing up to grab the natural life determinations and the spiritual life determinations from there. In terms of how it's different than natural life, natural life, Hegel says, is exposed to externality. He doesn't generate externality. So there's how his differentiation wants to work. That's how he wants to separate out logical life from natural life. Logical life is where the purpose, the tree, the impulse to differentiate generates everything. Whereas in natural life, it's dependent on, it's exposed to, that's what the exposure here means. It's dependent on externality itself for its very survival. Very different way of thinking about life. Life doesn't generate everything there in the natural world. It's dependent on the external world to be what it is. It's an organism in its environment, and it's dependent on its environment. That's the natural world. That's the natural sense of life. And then he says about spiritual life that it's determined in a threefold sense, as opposed to spirit. It's a means or an instrument. As one would spirit, it's our bodies. And as a unity reborn as the product of spirit itself, it is an ideality, right? It is something we produce of ourselves. But notice, that's a whole process we have to go through, a whole set of determinations for embodied beings. So, logical life as opposed to spirit as natural life is the means over against which, or opposed to which, spirit comes to be what it is. And yet natural life is at one with spirit, insofar as spirit is an individual, and thus natural life is its body, that through which and in which spirit manifests itself as the process of manifestation itself. So here's the way Hegel summarizes the distinction. Take a look at the bottom of 677 over to 678. The last line on 677, in both cases. You see where I'm at? In both cases? So in both cases, as natural life and as referring to spirit, life obtains a determinateness from its externality. In both cases, whether you're talking natural life or spiritual life, they obtain their determinateness from its externality. In one case, nature, through its presuppositions, such as our other formations of nature. Inorganic nature is the condition of life itself. It lives off of inorganic nature. That's what natural life is. And in the other case, spiritual life now, through the purposes and activity of spirit, so now natural life as the means, so the body is the means through which we realize our purposes. So that's spiritual life and natural life. What's logical life? He says there, this is on the top of 677, top of 678. He says, the idea of life for itself, that's his term for logical life. The idea of for itself is free from both the conditioning objectivity, presupposed in the first case. So it's not like nature, it's not dependent on its environment. Natural life is dependent on its environment. Logical life is not dependent on anything. It generates everything. Everything's dependent on it. And the reference to subjectivity in the second, there's no subjectivity involved here. In spiritual life, of course there is. Right? Spiritual life is all about recognition and realization of purposes. We set goals volitionally, we have goals cognitively, and we make use of our body, the organs of our bodies, to realize those goals. That's spiritual life making use of natural life, our body, to attain goals. But that's not what logical life does. Logical life is not imbued with a kind of agency. Right? There is no being that's striving after some goal, whether that goal is epistemic or practical. So the logical idea of life is really austere. It's my term for it. Right? It's very minimal. The logical idea of life is the impulse to differentiate, to particularize, where this impulse is neither conditioned by the inorganic, nor is it an instrument, a vehicle of something else. It is its own thing unto itself, and everything else depends on it. So again, the logical idea of life is the impulse to differentiate, to particularize, where this impulse is neither conditioned by external nature, nor is it an instrument or vehicle or an ideality of something else. It's an account of the impulse to differentiate, wholly immanent to this impulse as such. Question though, doesn't the account of life in those terms of as he will say now, a living individual, an organism, those are the terms he's about to use for it, does it not conceive of life precisely as conditioned by externality? I mean, aren't we about to read an account of, as he calls it, sensibility, irritability, reproduction that looks in some forms or another to be dependent on the surrounding environment in which it finds itself? So aren't we, despite his protestations, his claims to the contrary, are we not actually, in the logical sense of life, using natural life, really talking about natural life? Isn't it really conditioned by the inorganic domain of nature? Isn't it really dependent on that? Isn't that really what we have to, despite what Hegel says, isn't that what we have to conclude? Isn't what it means to be a living organism, which is the term he uses here, doesn't that just mean to be conditioned by its dependency on the inorganic for its own survival? So isn't that the way to understand here sensibility, irritability, reproduction as an organism surviving by virtue of living off of its environment that it's dependent on? Hegel's claim is that the life process of the living organism, sensibility, irritability, and reproduction, is actually not what it at least at first might appear to be. It is not an account of an organism conditioned by the externality of nature. Now, I don't expect that anybody read that and said, yeah, of course, that's not dependent on nature. You read it and you thought, I think he's talking about, when he's talking about assimilation, I think he's talking about eating. I mean, he's talking about an organism eating something, you know, the world around it. It's dependent on it in some way. And when he's talking about reproduction, I think he's talking about sex. I think he's talking about beings reproducing themselves, you know, like they do in the natural world. But again, his claim is that it's an account of the impulse to differentiate, what he calls here the originary judgment, the originary separation, as it posits the presupposition of immediate objectivity. That is, as it produces, not as it's conditioned by, but as it actually produces. That world's dependent on it. As that impulse sublates and thereby grounds the processes of mechanism, chemism, and extrinsic teleology, as it lives out that, positing that it is to say its own presuppositions in that way. It creates the world in which it then thrives. So the account of logical life as sensibility, irritability, reproduction is thus precisely, at least on Hegel's analysis, not an account of the dependency of life upon, conditioned by the inorganic, or even by other organic beings. But neither is it an account of life that would make of it a means, a body, or even an ideality. It's not spiritual or natural. Rather, it's an account of the immanent differentiating process endemic to life itself, purely as this impulse to differentiate. Now, with that account, what this account ultimately proves, here I'm going to leap to the end, but then fill in how we get there. What it ultimately proves is that the life process is not about the organism. It was never about the organism. So we get focused in on, oh, wait a minute, this organism has sensibility and irritability and reproduction. So we think, oh, this is about a living organism and how it survives or thrives or creates or whatever the world. And Hegel's point is that it's never about the organism itself. It is about what? It's about the impulse to differentiate, which means it's how the genus propagates itself. The genus life and how it propagates itself. We're looking at the life process, not the life of one organism, but the life process itself. So here's what Hegel writes on 688. So this is the conclusion of the account of life. We'll come back and walk our way back up to this. Here's what he writes. This is on 688. This is 191 in the German. Let's see. Find it. Where is it at? Let me see. Yeah, okay. I was looking at the top. It's at the bottom. Sorry. So the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of that page, 688, begins in copulation. So I told you we would get to sex. Here it is. The German term is begattung, right? Begattung. Okay? We'll talk about why that's significant in just a little bit. It's related to Gattung, obviously. In copulation, the immediacy of the living individuality perishes, is stripped, vanishes, falls apart. The death of this life is the emergence of spirit. The death of this life is the emergence of spirit. The idea, which as genus is implicit, is now explicit. It had been implicit in the living organism, and now the genus becomes explicit into itself. It really was never about the organism, it was always about the life process itself. In that it has sublated its particularity that constituted the living species, that's Geschlechter, so you can translate it as species or sexes. We'll come back and talk about that. And has thereby given itself a reality that is itself simple universality. As such, it is the idea that relates itself to itself as idea. The universal that has universality for its determinateness and existence, the idea of cognition. So there's the transition into the discussion of cognition. So we could say that spirit, notice this is the first time in 680 pages worth of this book that we've ever talked about spirit. He wrote a whole book about the phenomenology of spirit. Didn't say a word about it in this book up until now. Right? It says, now we have spirit. What does he say about it? He says spirit just is life insofar as life is nothing other than the impulse to differentiate as the process of propagating the species. This is the genus propagating itself. That's all it is. By doing what? Specifying itself, differentiating itself, particularizing itself. But if logical life is neither natural nor spiritual, then how are we to understand cognition, the truth of life, its ground? How are we to make any sense of that? Well, here we go. We've got the same problem. If we can't understand life, how do we understand cognition if it can't be natural, if it can't be spiritual either? So what do we mean by, that's what life ultimately gets us to. Then what do we ultimately mean by life itself? Well, now come back and look at 679, the living individual. And as I hope to show you by looking at that final passage, the point of this chapter is not about the living individual, even though I know it starts there. Right? The point of the chapter is about the genus, not about the individual that is an expression of, an embodiment of, a differentiated moment of the genus itself. So Hegel's claim is that the movement of the concept, the generative process that constitutes the set of relations in and through which things are both immediately determinate and immediately determinate or grounded, so they both are and are what they are, is initially most properly determined in terms of the activity endemic to a living being. The objectivity of the living thing is an organism, he says, which is an immanent means and instrument of purpose. So it's an immanent means and instrument of purpose. It's not purpose itself. It's an immanent means and instrument, the organism is, of purpose itself. We know purpose is this process. So already the living being, the organism, is a conduit, a vehicle for the process that is going on through it, not that is under its control. It's not under its control. Insofar as being an organism is to be a corporeal living creature, the process of living is always fundamentally about the relation of the organic to the inorganic, where the latter, the inorganic, stands as the presupposition of the former, the organic. So far we sound like we're defining natural life still. But as he's going to remind us, this isn't that, and it's not that because the inorganic is created, produced by the organic, which is not the case in the philosophy of nature. So he says, initially then, life is defined by the need to assimilate, to consume this essential element, this fundament or environment within which and by virtue of which the organism sustains itself. The process of life is thus fundamentally, as he says on 682 to 683, so take a look at this, 682 to 683, it has this threefold structure of sensibility, irritability, and reproduction. Let's basically walk our way through this. Sensibility is the capacity of an organism, a living organism, to sense or feel, it's not yet self-consciousness, but to sense or feel its own structure, can sense the limits of its own structure. Irritability is its receptiveness and responsiveness to its external stimuli. And reproduction is the self-maintenance of an organism by the regeneration first of its organs. So if we're just talking about the living individual, just the sustaining of its own being, its own integrity as a being. but eventually it will be obviously reproduction in the sense of propagation of new beings, or of the species. Hegel holds that in the functioning of these capacities, what he calls the external life process, the organism posits itself, as he says, quote, this is 686. 686, this is 189 in the German. Second to find, I didn't mark this. Negative inputs. I'm not finding it. I don't want to belabor it. So he says here that it's the external life process. The organism posits itself, as he says, for itself as the negative unity of its otherness, as the foundation of itself. So it's not dependent on the outside world, right, as we have in the natural realm, even to a different degree in the spiritual realm. It's dependent purely on itself. In the life process, the organism has the certainty of the intrinsic nullity of the otherness confronting it. Nullity, right? It doesn't have anything unto its own. It doesn't stand on its own. It's only there because of what the life process is doing to engender it. It follows that the organism is able to effect significant change in the mechanical and chemical objectivity that confronts it by doing what? By assimilating it. He calls it this on 685, so if you back up one page here, 685, and this is the beginning, the second, beginning of the, where is it at? Beginning of the full paragraph over to 686. So he writes, now the subject, the second paragraph down on the page. Now the subject, insofar as in being determined in its need, it connects with the outside and consequently is itself something external or an instrument, exercises violence over the object. There's this thing of violence, extrinsicality comes up again here as it imposes itself on this the environment. In particular character, its finitude in general falls into the more determinate appearances of this relation. The external factor in this is the process of objectivity in general, mechanism and chemism, so there we're relating it back to the objective world and its layers of mechanism and chemism. But this same process is immediately interrupted and the externality transformed into interiority. There's the transformation from extrinsic teleology to intrinsic teleology. The external purposiveness, which is at first elicited in the indifferent object by the activity of the subject, is thereby sublated, for as against the concept, the object is not a substance. The concept therefore cannot become for it just an external form, but must rather posit itself as its essence and as the determinateness immanently pervading it through and through in conformity with the concept's original identity. So it engenders this. It's not taking it in and subsuming it, it's engendering. So here's how assimilation happens, what you could call the natural domain. Eating, right, happens because extrinsic teleology is made possible through intrinsic teleology. Then he says, next paragraph down, by seizing hold, this is the last two lines of 685, by seizing hold of the object, the mechanical process passes over into an internal process. There we move from objectivity to inner purposiveness. The mechanical process passes over into an internal process by which the individual appropriates the object in such a manner that it takes away from it its distinctive makeup, makes it into a means, and confers upon it its own subjectivity as its substance. This assimilation thus coincides with the individual's process of reproduction considered above. This is how you sustain your life, right? This is how the living being sustains itself. And in this process, the individual feeds on itself in the sense that it makes its own objectivity its object. The stuff it's produced, it's making its object of assimilation. Notice in the natural world, this is not the case. It's feeding on something that's other than it. So the mechanical and chemical conflict of its members with external things is an objective moment of itself. The mechanical and chemical factor in the process is the beginning of the dissolution of the living thing. And here we go with how everything that is made of this will actually ultimately fall apart from this as an individual. But then look at what he says at the end of this discussion. This is in many ways, the key moment of the analysis. So he's done all this stuff to say, here's what a living organism is. But as we already know, right, the point of the chapter is not about life process of a living organism. It's about the life process of the genus, life itself. So he says, last two lines of that section right above, the genus. Through the external life process, it has consequently posited itself as a real universal life, as genus. Now, if you were in the natural domain, you would say, oh, it's posited, it's eked out its own existence, it now survives as a singular individual organism. It's able to survive, it's able to live, it has life unto itself, and it's able to survive within its environment that it is dependent upon. That's what you would say in the natural context. But in the logical context, you would say, actually, no, that's not what it's shown at all. What it's shown is that which it produces out of itself. Objectivity produces out of itself. It then sustains itself on that which it produces out of itself. So what's going on here is the genus is what's on view, life itself, not the individual animal, not the individual organism, not the individual living creature. That's an instrument, as he called it, a vehicle, a means, for the genus to do its work. As he says, through the external life process, it has consequently posited itself as real universal life, as genus. So Hegel thinks that the logical sense of life is the logical sense of life qua genus life, not qua individual organism life. And he's done everything he can at this point to battle against equating the process of life simply with the living organism itself. He started off by telling you the living organism is nothing other than an instrument, a means for something else, the concept to do its work. And once you see it doing its work, once you see a living organism living, then you see the genus explicitly posited as the genus itself. Because it's producing everything. It's doing what a genus does. Remember, for Hegel, genuses produce their own particularizations. They differentiate themselves. So there's that impulse to differentiate, that impulse to particularize. That's what the genus is. So then he says this, under the genus. We'll have to work our way through what a genus is to make some sense of what he says here, but let's at least getting out on the table. He says, the living individual at first, cut off from the universal concept of life, is a presupposition yet unproven through itself. So that's where we started this. This is Hegel rehearsing. Where have we been? How did we get to where we're at? So we started with the living organism, cut off from the genus. Through its process with the simultaneously presupposed world, it has posited itself for itself as the negative unity of its otherness, as the foundation of itself. So it's self-determining. It's a free concept. But it's no longer simply that individual anymore. It's the genus now of life at work in that being. Thus it is the actuality of the idea, so that the individual now brings itself forth out of actuality, whereas before it proceeded only from the concept. And its coming to be, which was a presupposition, now becomes its production. He then says, top of 687, still in 190, now in 190 in the German. But the further determination that it has attained by the sublation of the opposition is that it is genus. Identity of itself with its hitherto indifferent otherness. This idea of the individual, since it is the essential identity, is essentially the particularization of itself. That message we've been having since we began the subjective logic. What is universality? Nothing other than the particularization of itself. This particularization, its disruption, he says, in keeping with the totality from which it proceeds, is the duplication of the individual, the presupposing of an objectivity that is identical with it, and a relating of the living being to itself as to another living being. Now, what in the world does that mean? Great, let's try to figure that out. But to do that, we're just trying to figure out what it means to say that we're now talking not about the living organism, but we're talking about life itself, which the living organism is but one manifestation of. So what do we mean by genus? Well, genus in German is Gattung. So Begattung, propagation of the species, is the furthering of the genus. Historically, genus has an array of meanings. Right? So if you look in the standard books, German dictionaries at the time, here's the various things it would have meant. Hegel knew all these. It's a substantive noun referring to the process of reproduction. That's one thing that genus meant, Gattung meant, is the process of reproduction. It's a class concept referring to people or things that belong together in some way. That's the way we still tend to hear it, genus. It's a term designating an abstraction from individuals of a common species, is what they all hold in common. and it's a way of speaking about how things are, how they show up. So most fundamental for our purposes, at least to begin with, is the idea that Gattung, genus, is a classification of entities that is divided into subclasses by virtue of a distinguishing mark or feature, a specific difference. These subclasses are then the species of the more general covering concept, the genus. A genus is therefore the class to which the species subordinate to it are related, and it in turn is the genus, and it in turn, that is the genus, is itself a species in relation to the wider class to which it belongs, right? Aristotle famously says in the physics or the metaphysics, maybe in the categories, that being is the ultimate genus. Right? Everything else belongs to it. It's not, there's nothing more higher than genus being itself. So in itself, every organism is a member of a genus. That is to say, every living creature is classifiable as organic as opposed to inorganic. But that is only its self-feeling, its preconscious sense of its own physicality and bodily integrity. Consequently, an individual organism is in itself genus, but not yet for itself genus. Well, how does a living organism, a natural living organism, how does it become for itself genus? By propagating itself, reproduction. By Begattung, copulation. So Hegel's thesis is that Gattung is, and fundamentally is always, the Gattung. That's his claim. Gattung, genus, is and always is propagation, copulation. It just is the particularization of itself. To put it in the formal language we learned back in the subjectivity chapter, genus is disjunctive. It others itself, and by virtue of othering itself, becomes itself. It is itself in and through that differentiation of itself. So Hegel then, in talking about the genus, says, look, what we're talking about with the genus is not a covering concept. We're not talking about the genus as it's standardly been understood. It's not the ultimate class to which all lower level species and ultimately individuals belong. That's not the way he's thinking about a genus. The genus just is nothing other than, it really denotes nothing other than the propagation of itself through its own differentiation. That's all it is. The propagation of itself through its own differentiation. So in that sense, the genus just is nothing other than its own reproduction. How does that occur? Well, it's almost like you were a kid saying, where do babies come from? Right? Where does propagation happen? How does it take place? And Hegel tells you in the logic, literally, logically, how this operates. So look on page 688 for your logic of sex, or logic of reproduction lesson. He says here, look at the last paragraph now. We'll come back to this paragraph just before it because it's complex and important, but look at this last paragraph. That is to say, everybody see where I'm at? That last paragraph on 688. He writes, that is to say, the process of the genus. Notice he's talking about genus as a process, like he talks about purpose as a process. It's a process always for him. The process is the genus in which the single individuals sublate in one another their indifferent immediate concrete existence, and in this negative unity die away. The moment of propagation is the moment of the death of the individual. Has further the realized genus that has posited itself as identical with the concept for the other side of its product. So Hegel's point is that the life process, which is lived through the individuals, is really something that takes place through them, but is not reducible to them. Because for it to persist, for it to, better said, not persist so much, but for it to go on and differentiate itself even more, those individuals have to pass away. It does two things, he says in this discussion. Reproduction does two things. It produces another living individuality, it produces offspring, which is In Hegel's account, at the logical level, at the natural level and spiritual level, not so. But at the logical level, that's secondary. The fact that it produces another living organism, fine. But that's not really the point of the whole thing. Because again, it's not about the organisms. It's about life as such itself. So it doesn't just produce another living individuality. That's not what reproduction propagation does. It produces the actuality of the genus itself also. The genus is this differentiating process. The becoming for itself of the genus that was in itself, the idea in relation with itself specifically as idea. So now back up. This is where I'm back up the page now a bit. He says, go back to 687, sorry. Now let's come down to the second paragraph down. Let's just proceed through and watch this unfold. He says this. This universal, he's talking about the genus now. This universal is the third stage, the truth of life insofar as life is still shut up within itself. Right? We don't yet have it fully everything, but it's life unto itself. This stage is the process of the individual as it relates to itself, where the externality is the individual's immanent moment and is besides itself a living totality and objectivity, which for the individual is the individual itself. It's producing this externality. An externality in which the individual has certainty of itself not as being sublated, but as subsisting. Why? Because it's produced that. Right? So it's not dependent on it. It's produced externality. It's produced the world, objectivity, mechanism, chemism. Now, because the relation of genus is the identity of individual self-feeling in such a one who is at the same time another self-subsistent individual, it is a contradiction. Every living organism is both itself and not itself. It is itself because it's a living organism, it's alive, but it also is more than alive, more than itself. It's alive as a genus, as a differentiation, a moment of the genus. It is a contradiction accordingly. The living being is once more impulse. It's the same term he's been using, trieb. An impulse to do what? To differentiate. The genus is indeed now the completion of the idea of life, but at first it is still within the sphere of immediacy. This universality is therefore actual in a singular shape. Universality actual in a singular shape, right? Universality is there, it's in itself, it's not been yet rendered for itself. It hasn't been made, posited, it will be, but it hasn't yet been. And consequently, the individual, although it is the genus in itself rather than for itself, he says. What is for it is as yet only another living individual. Now, that line has been taken to mean that Hegel is talking at the logical level of reproduction has to be sexual between two beings who reproduce by virtue of contributing to one another in various kinds of ways. So it's sexual reproduction, not asexual reproduction. So he's talking about living organisms, not amoebas, right, who can reproduce themselves. That's what that line's been taken to mean. Right? Let me leave it at that. So he says, it is in itself rather than for itself. What is for it is as yet only another living individual. The concept distinguished from itself has for object, with which is identical, not itself as concept, but a concept rather that as a living being has at the same time external objectivity for it, a form which is therefore immediately reciprocal. So there's a relationship between one living organism and another living organism. Then look at what he says. The identity with the other individual. The universality of the individual is thus still only inner or subjective. It therefore has the longing to posit this individual or this identity and to realize itself as universal. We've got a longing here, right? Something striving after something. At the natural level, at the spiritual level, we would call that sexual desire. At the natural level, at the spiritual level, we call that perhaps love or desire. Here, it's a longing to posit the universal. But this impulse of the genus can realize itself only through the sublation of the singular individualities, plural, that are still particular to each other. So it can't realize it in the other being, and the other being can't realize it in me. It can't realize the genus in either one of us. It's got to realize that in what we produce together. At first, insofar as it is these individualities which in themselves universal, themselves satisfy their tension of their longing and dissolve themselves into the universality of this genus, their realized individuality is the negative unity of the genus reflecting itself into itself out of its rupture. I don't think that's normally how we describe sex, but that's what he's talking about, right? In the natural level, in the spiritual level. To this extent, it is the individuality of life itself, no longer generated out of its concept, but out of the actual idea. At first, it is itself only the concept that still has to objectify itself, but a concept that is actual, the germ of a living individual. The germ of a living individual. To ordinary perception, what the concept is, and that the subjective concept has external actuality, are visibly present in it. For the germ of the living being is the complete concretion of individuality. It is where all the living beings' diverse sides, its properties, and articulated differences. He's talking about a seed. Right? This is sperm and egg, natural and spiritual domain, are connected in their entire determinateness, where the at first immaterial subjective totality is present, undeveloped, simple, and non-situous. Thus the germ is the wholly living being in the inner form of the concept. He's just giving you the logic of sex, yes? Now look at what he does in the next paragraph. From this side, the genus obtains actuality through its reflection into itself. For the moment of negative unity and individuality is therefore posited in it, the propagation of the living species. That's Geschlechter, so you can translate it as living species. I think that'll work here, but it could also be translated because Geschlecht means many different things. Anybody who's gone through Derrida's Geschlecht writings knows this, right? But anybody back in this time would have known it as well. It means, among other things that are relevant here, sexes. Right? So it's a propagation of the sexes. The idea, which as life is still in the form of immediacy, thus falls back into actuality, and its reflection is now only the repetition of the infinite process in which it does not step outside the finitude of its immediacy. It's made another living being. Okay? That's all it's done. That's the repetition. It's made another one of us. Like begats like, as Aristotle told us. And here's another one of those damn things. Another being. It's alive. But then look at what he says. But this going back to its first concept, it's now life has produced life, right? So going back to its first concept. But this going back to its first concept also has the higher side. So we did it from this side. This side is all about the little seed. The seed becomes another human being, so it produces offspring. But from the higher side, it's not the production of offspring. What is it? Look what he says. That the idea has not only run through the mediation of its processes inside immediacy, but just because it has run through them, has sublated this immediacy, it's not just about the individual, and has thereby elevated itself to a higher form of its existence. What's that? Now, next paragraph. That is to say, right, what I've just tried to articulate, from the higher side, the process of the genus in which the single individuals sublate in one another their indifferent, immediate, concrete existence, reproduction, and in this negative unity die away. There's this side of things, right? So they're producing offspring. They're continuing, they're propagating their species. But Hegel says what also is going on there has further the realized genus that has posited itself as identical with the concept for the other side of its product. In copulation, you get the genus realized. So what is this really about? Is it about the living organism and its dependency on the natural world? No. The living organism is not dependent on the natural world. As a logical structure, as a logical concept of life, life is not dependent on its environment to live. Life is what goes on in living organisms. And as living organisms propagate themselves, they propagate not just themselves, but they also propagate the species. They don't do so intentionally, right? They're not sitting down and going, hey, we need to have more kids, because we need to propagate the species. No. They're having kids because they're born out of contradiction. Right? Literally how Hegel describes this. They're universals. They're living beings, but they're living beings that are singular living beings. They're singular universals that want to posit themselves as genuinely universal. How do they do that? Well, they do so by positing another singular universal, an offspring, But they also do it because in that same process, the process of propagation, of copulation, of reproduction, they also produce the genus itself. So the life process goes on in them and produces itself by differentiating itself through them. Now that's why Hegel wants to differentiate between the offspring produced in the logic of reproduction and the genus that's produced, differentiated, furthered in this moment of, in that same moment of copulation, that same moment of reproduction. Now, I gave it my best shot to tell you what Hegel's saying about the logic of sex, or at least the logic of reproduction. There's a lot of stuff to talk about here. Right? So let me take a few minutes and see what questions you must have about that. Because that's, insane. This doesn't belong in the logic. Right? What in the world is he even talking about this for? What do you think? It makes perfect sense. I'm wrong. I'm sorry. I'm the idiot in the room. Everyone's like, yeah, of course. I mean, this is why we reproduce. I mean, I know all that lovely stuff the poets talk about is all wonderful and great and grand, and I know all that wonderful stuff in biology class was, really interesting and whatnot. But here's what's really going on, right? At the ontological level, this is what's going on. That's Hegel's claim. That is absolutely Hegel's claim. I don't want to back off that one bit. Hegel is literally saying that the logical structure of life is not natural life, abstracted. It's not spiritual life with some other bits taken away. He's saying that this is the more fundamental account underlying the natural and the spiritual, because this process generates objectivity itself, and the way it generates itself in generating objectivity is that it makes use of objectivity to generate offspring, but ultimately the offspring are secondary to the genus process itself, which is really being realized here, and not just the individual offspring themselves. Yeah?
So creating more problems.
Yep.
As having children.
Yep.
Comes secondary, logically, ontologically.
Yeah.
Then how does his twofold explanation of the genus, I can follow the first one, reproduction, but the second one, taxonomy, how does that one work?
So Hegel wants to say about taxonomy that that's a secondary thing you can do by virtue of the fact that this ontological sense of genus has already done its work. So the genus differentiates itself. And because it differentiates itself, the world is full of a lot of different things that you could then classify together and do taxonomies of. You can do classifications and categorizations of the world on the basis of this, right? So the genus process does really populate the world of all the varieties and different things that we see it populated with. So you can speak at that point of a kind of, as a consequence of this, natural kinds, right? You can speak of that as secondary effect of what the genus process does for Hegel. Is it produces natural kinds out there in the world, which we can collect then into taxonomies and hope we get right or wrong or whatever. That's what the scientific knowledge should be, one of the things it should be doing. That's at a lower level for him. The only way that's possible to have those taxonomic categories, by which we categorize things fundamentally as organic or non-organic, just to take the biggest, broadest distinction, but then we could do plant, animal, human, those kinds of things. The only way that's possible is because the genus has already done its work, or is continually doing its work, put it that way, because I don't think it's finished, right, for Hegel. It's doing its work of differentiating itself.
Can I ask
Yeah. So let me just follow one thing there, and that means this is why that's why it has to reproduce itself, because it's not. I mean, as he said earlier, it's not a dead repose, right? The genus is not something fixed and dead. The genus is a life process, and here it is alive. It's alive through this logical sense of life is alive through. It makes use of living organisms, to carry out its own reproduction. So there's where we could talk about a kind of modified extrinsic teleology, modified because now it's not about the concept in relation to objectivity, but the concept within objectivity itself, making use of something within objectivity to express itself and to further itself, to differentiate itself. It produces offspring, but by virtue of this, but it also produces the determinations of the genus itself. It realizes the genus itself. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
If we apply the threefold natural life,
Yeah.
Spiritual life, and logical life, sexual drive, love, and whatever that is,
The impulse to differentiate.
the impulse to differentiate to this schema. First, the singularity, particularity, universalization
Yeah.
happens, but in order that one to happen, we need to have the middle term as the universalization. So is that mechanism also proves that the logical life has to happen? If that's the case, doesn't it mean that every living being has to reproduce? And if we apply that to human world, doesn't it mean concretely that if you don't have children, you don't get the logical idea of life?
Yeah. You're not fully alive.
Yes.
Yeah. So I appreciate that question because I think there's a multitude of
Which
questions.
concerns me a lot.
You need to get to reproducing, right? Concerns a lot of people alive, not just you. I mean, you have to do what
A
Hegel
reason not to
You have to
be
do what Hegel
Hegelian.
says. Come on, you know. You have obligations to propagate the family, right?
No.
That's not going to be the answer, by the way.
On that side.
So here's what I think about that, right? Hegel's not saying that every individual, in order to be alive, has to propagate the species. That's not his claim.
Okay.
His claim is that the concept makes use of individuals to propagate itself, to differentiate itself, and to propagate itself in and through individuals, but it's not the obligation, moral or ontological, for them to be this. Right? And they're not incomplete individuals insofar as they don't do this. That's not the claim, as I read it at least, not at all. So I do think the claim is that life propagates itself. It propagates itself through individuals. It propagates itself through individuals reproducing themselves in the various ways in which individuals can propagate and reproduce themselves. I want to come back and talk about whether it's sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. I know it sounds incredibly stupid to be talking about that, but I actually don't think Hegel's committed to sexual reproduction here, right? All he needs is an impulse to differentiate. It would not require, I mean, he describes it here clearly as having another component, right? Another living individual. That's why there's plural, living individualities. But I don't think that the logic commits him to that. So, I mean, this is an argument only a Hegelian would have about these texts. But it is worth thinking about for a moment, right? Does it really entail sexual reproduction, or could it be asexual reproduction? I think it could be asexual reproduction. But his claim is not that anything to be what it is has to reproduce. It's just that the concept is itself through that reproduction, whenever and whomever to which it occurs. Right? But it's not an ontological obligation or moral obligation. Does that make sense?
Yes. No.
I think this has, by the way, I think this has repercussions that are fairly long way down the road, right, from this. But I do think there are ramifications to think about in the case of when Hegel's talking about a properly formed society. What does a properly formed society look like? According to him, it has family, civil society, and the state. And that sounds like everybody's got to have a family, and that means not only must you be a descendant of a family, that's pretty easy, you were born, but you have to also replicate that structure for yourself. You have to have children, spouse, those kinds of things. I actually think Hegel's not committed to that, for reasons we can talk about there, but they're rooted back in this. Right? Because what's really important there is not the individuals. This gets them in trouble. It's really not about the individuals, right? It's about right itself. Right? Not about the individuals and their own propagation of the species. It's not a natural life concept. Right? It's a spiritual life concept. It's quite different. It's related to this. It's rooted in this. And one of the things it's rooted in is it's not about the individuals. It's about the concept, right? That they are expressing in, between them, or through them.
Yeah.
Which is a different question. But it gets to, do we have obligations to marry and reproduce? Which it sounds like you do if you just read the philosophy of right straightforwardly. But that would be to impose a natural life conception on spiritual life. Matter. What question comes here?
So just a shot in the dark about why
Yeah.
this belongs here. And so I'm thinking how it relates to the disjunctive syllogism
Okay.
and the genus there.
Yeah.
And the fact that there we were using the example of triangle.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering how this might affect that or change the situation there, or how we're supposed to read genus there.
Yeah, so the genus is nothing other than its differentiation into its very species. That's what the triangularity is, nothing unto itself. It is isosceles and the other forms of triangles. So that's the way to read it in the disjunctive syllogism. So we would say that the genus is nothing other than its disjunction. It's one way of understanding what universality means there. It is its proliferation, its differentiation. And I think that's the way to hear this here, right? It's the genus, but notice the genus is not the individual, it's the species, right? It's the propagation of the Geschlechter, propagation of the species. And that means at the species level, which is what we're talking about, the various species of triangles, various kinds of triangles. That's what we're talking about again here. We're talking about the proliferation of or propagation of the species, differentiation of the genus itself. What that eventuates in, what that creates, he doesn't specify that, because you can't specify that at this ontological level, what those different species might or might not be. But that there would be speciation, to use a kind of bastardized term there a little bit, yes, absolutely, there has to be. That's all that genus is. And that's what he means, that's what he's talking about with the realized genus, right? The realized genus is not, life has now come, right? We finally now have life realized, because that would be, life is a dead repose, life is a dead object, is an abstract concept. Life is the specification of all of these beings that are alive. That's what life is. Life is nothing over and above. So like we've said repeatedly, universality is nothing over and above its particularization. The genus is nothing over and above its specification. Is that useful?
So you kind of, I think you're saying, you're pointing out how it's applicable, but I'm trying to think how what's happening here is different from what was happening.
I don't think it's different.
You don't think
I literally think, I mean, he could as easily say on these pages, and that means that reproduction is disjunctive syllogism, just like he did in objectivity. And yet I know that's scary because he's saying reproduction is the disjunctive syllogism, sex is the disjunctive syllogism, nobody wants to think that way, right?
Well, I'm just
That
thinking,
is his claim.
But I'm just thinking back at when we were just talking about the disjunctive syllogism, we did not say that, and we
Nope.
were talking about triangles.
Yeah.
And
Didn't know we were going to get to this because we didn't have objectivity.
yeah.
But once you have objectivity,
So something has changed.
well, yeah, the status of the concept has changed, right? The concept there was a formal concept, right?
Mhm.
Not yet objective. So we talked about it in abstract terms, in formal terms. Now we're going to talk about it as a moment within and literally the generator of objectivity itself. Now the genus takes on a different status than a kind of concept that gets parsed out into various kinds of, and becomes equatable simply with its various different differentiations. Right?
So would it be fair to say that now we realize that the triangle was not really an appropriate example?
It's not appropriate to the genus as at this level.
At this
Absolutely not.
level,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That's the point. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly
that's
right.
what
No. I'm
yeah.
sorry, I missed that.
Okay,
Excellent point. It's not the same thing as saying, look, you can differentiate or separate out different kinds of triangles.
Yeah.
Right? This is clearly not the same thing as that. Why? Because that triangularity was a dead repose abstract concept
Yeah.
that you could differentiate, separate into various different kinds of triangles. Absolutely. Here we're talking about life, which is already itself a process, and that process is being differentiated across its propagation through organisms. Does that
Yeah.
help with that?
Thanks.
'Cause that's a really good point. I had not thought about it in that way. To me, it is the disjunctive syllogism, but the disjunctive syllogism now, in objectivity, now alive, quite literally, but as a process, not a logical process anymore, but now a life process, an objective process. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, Ken.
So, this is sort of predicated on Noah's question, but
Sure,
it's
sure.
something I've already thinking about it before, and it's about the relationship between the account of difference that we have in the subjective logic versus what we get here in the objective logic.
Yeah.
So in the subjective logic, we have a formal account of difference. It's abstract.
Yeah.
And here, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call it material, but we can also call it like an objective account of
Yeah,
difference.
I'm fine with that. Yeah.
And so, on the one hand, I want to say you can do this. You can just lay them over the top of each other and be like, okay, reproduction is a disjunctive syllogism.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm annoyed by, at least in trying to think this through, is that, well, they're not. One is necessarily entailed by the other, and so it seems very strange to me.
Which one is entailed by the other?
Objectivity. That we move from the account of difference in the subjective logic. We finish with syllogism, right?
Yep.
And we finish with the disjunctive syllogism.
Yep.
And it flows into, it's like, okay, now we have objectivity. And so I guess my question is if you could...
So, but just stop there for a second, right? Because I want to push you about this. I think this is a really, really important point. And you said what we all presume, right? That, if I understood you correctly, so correct me if I've got you wrong, that material disjunctive syllogism is predicated on and founded on the formal subjective syllogism, right?
Yeah.
But that's not Hegel's claim, right? This is the truth of that. This, the material disjunctive, is the truth of the formal disjunction. So the triangularity thing is secondarily derivable from this process, which is the deeper process itself. So this is retrogressive grounding, right? This is what is more fundamental than that. It's because of this that the disjunctive syllogism at the formal level will operate, not the reverse. Does that help?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that somewhat answers the follow-up, which is that somewhat justifies perhaps the fact that we're about to talk about cognition, right? If it's a retrogressive grounding, it's like, okay, well, here we have these formal, abstract.
Yeah, yes. So we didn't talk about cognition when we were talking about judgments and syllogisms and concepts. We didn't talk about cognition at all there, even though arguably all of those are processes of cognition, right? You conceptualize, you judge, and you infer, so those are all things we should have been talking. Those are all features of the process of cognition. Now we finally get to cognition, and it's about, but I want to be cautious about that only because even here, even though we've got spirit for the first time show up on 688, cognition is not going to be something that an agent comes along and starts doing. Agency never shows up in this book. I mean, this is the problem, right? There's no being, whether divine or human, that starts doing things all of a sudden in the book. So cognition is not going to be, as frustrating as this is, cognition is not going to be a mental process. Our minds are God's minds process. And that's going to be difficult to swallow, just like this is difficult to swallow. But because the claim about cognition is for him a process claim about the nature of reality. It's about how literally the concept makes the world knowable, right? It's how we can know things about the world because the world is set up as to be knowable. That's because the concept has already pre-laid out the world to be knowable. And then yes, we can come along with our minds or God's mind or whatever and know it. The cognition chapter, as I read it, is an account of why the world is intelligible. Because it's conceptually determined, right, is the answer to that. But the conceptual determination is not something we do to the world, right? And it's not something we bring to the world and impose upon it. It's something the world already has and we have insight into it. So that's why, here's a couple terms that Hegel doesn't use, but I think if we've worked on these terms fairly well, I think it accurately captures what he's talking about. Hegel is a conceptual realist. A conceptual realist. By that I mean he thinks the concept's out there in the world. It's not mind dependent, right? So it's out there in the world, and it generates everything that is, including the knowability of the world, its cognizability of the world, the fact that it's alive. Everything is this. There's one thing, monistic, it's a living whole. That living whole is also cognizable. That's where we're at. And then, only then, can we then say, okay, what would be the method of that knowledge? And that's the absolute method at the end. Does that
No, that is helpful.
make some sense?
Just to keep the aspect of retrogressive grounding. I guess this is the first maybe part of this where I've really felt that at least maybe that there's this implicit pushback on. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, there is some sort of necessary entailment, but obviously what's happening in the objectivity section is the truth of what we are reading in the subject. And this is the first time that seems complicated for me, or
Yeah.
at least not. I'm not able to just, okay, Hegel, I'll take you at your word.
Yeah.
This is the first
No.
place where I want to.
So let me just be clear about options of where to go here in terms of interpretation of this material. because I think it's helpful, because it is recalcitrant, let's call it that, to fitting in. I mean, Hegel admits it, it doesn't look like it belongs in the logic at all, and you want to say, by the end of it, right, it doesn't look like it belongs there at all. There are some people who read it, Karen Ng reads it this way, by the way, as, oh, this account of life is an account of the organism role within the logic. So it's a way of thinking about what cognition is and what organic beings having cognition really means in the logic. So it's really Hegel coming to see, at the end of it, here's what it is to be a being who can know these things that we talked about all the way up through objectivity, say, roughly. I'm paraphrasing massively. But that's roughly the argument of that book that Karen Ng wrote about this issue. I'm paraphrasing it, but I think that's true to what her claim is about this. Now, she's taken that in a different direction. Obviously, I'm saying it's ontological. She's saying it's already intersubjective, right? That it is a form of subjectivity, not in the sense in which Hegel's using the term here to mean formal, but in the sense of agent subjectivity, human beings. And so this is a precursor, this is the way she takes it, a precursor for her, this account of life and cognition is a precursor to what Feuerbach and Marx would do with the notion of species being. So this is where she would take something like this. So there's another option, a way to read this, that concedes the point about, well, look, this is massively naturalistic, even if it isn't natural straightforwardly. So what is it doing here and how should we account for that? What's the change of venue almost, right? We've really moved from talking about the concept in objectivity to talking about the concept in objectivity, but then we talk about the concept in objectivity as an organism. That looks to be where we dropped off and started talking about something other than a logical, ontological structure. Is that useful as a...
No, it is. I mean, I guess, I think I'm wedded to the no, this is still an ontological account.
I think that's what Hegel thinks it is, right? But that doesn't mean that's the best way to read it, right? Itself. Right? There might be more productive ways of trying to take what's going on here. It's terribly disconcerting, right? Hegel, again, acknowledges this doesn't look like it belongs here. And because that's the case, lots of people have tried to say, well, what it really is X, Y, or Z. I've given you one example. You've got another one in the readings that we've done. Thank you for that. Other comments? Yeah, Nico.
I was going to ask about Kearney, but you've already addressed that a decent amount. But if you did have more remarks on that, I'm curious. But is this why you described her early on in the course when we were talking about the different paradigms of understanding Hegel along the systematic, non-systematic, and metaphysical, non-metaphysical, where she wants to take a more metaphysical approach, but it's because she takes the life chapters already intersubjective and having to deal with organisms that's why it can end up in the non-metaphysical camp?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No.
I think that it's the way what she has to say about the life chapter and cognition chapters for her is a nascent account of an intersubjectivity, or just more broadly speaking, a cognitive moment in the science of logic. Because it ends with that, because it comes to that at its conclusion, that the implication of that for the rest of the logic is that those are all concepts relevant to, and always only relative to, that cognitive apparatus that's being described here. And that renders it then more epistemological, more non-metaphysical than metaphysical and ontological. So yes, is the simple answer to that. What she thinks about life means, although she has writings about actuality chapter and other things that don't do that, don't take it to be merely categories by which we know the world. She takes them to be, well, she doesn't really have a stance on that matter terribly much. But in the book, she seems to have that, she clearly does have that view. In responding to criticisms of her book about this, she seems to double down on that position. And the implication, I think, is that it means that it renders the rest of the book categories by which self-consciousness knows the world, which is a version of the Pippin thesis, right? About apperception being the condition of the possibility of everything. So these are the categories by which apperception can take place.
So, and sorry to put you up for bat for a different scholar, but is there a way then that these thinkers, how do these thinkers handle like how does Karenin then handle the philosophy of nature in the organism chapter of that as being a separate part of the system, or I don't know, there's more to this system than just logic for Hegel. That's very crucial.
Yeah. As important as this is,
Yes.
right, there is more. Disappointingly, right? Oh my God, are we not finished? Right? There's more. How does she handle it? I've never seen her handle it, so I don't know. So I can't say. It's not to say she can't handle it. There's a lot of people who want to read the philosophy of nature volume, that section, that part of the encyclopedia, as being consonant with what they're doing in the logic by saying, well, these are the categories that are the conditions of the possibility of what nature would be for us. So it's a further reading out of that non-metaphysical account, non-existential account of what's going on there. I don't know how you make sense of the book that way, right? But directly, exegetically, I just don't. You've got all sorts of passages that work against that. But you can still make, they do it with this, so they can do it with that, right? And they've done that with that. They've done that with the philosophy of spirit as well. I'm not saying that Karen does it that way. I'm just saying that it's understandable how you could take this view and go into those texts and talk about them in that way. Now, there has been a resurgence of scholarly interest in the philosophy of nature, Naturphilosophie more generally, and the resurgence of interest is really predicated on taking it as an ontological a priori text, rather than taking it as a epistemological, categorical, non-metaphysical text. That being true there and also being true in the philosophy of spirit. That's the way I read the scholarship going. But those are trends. They vary from time to time.
Based off your market research.
Say what?
Based off your market research.
Based off the market research I've done on a regular basis, I have to read this secondary literature. Lucky me. I mean that actually. Other comments, questions? All right, so next week I want to come back and look at the cognition chapter. We'll talk again about the life chapter, obviously, to remind ourselves of how that's premised on, the cognition chapter is premised on it. But obviously, again, we want to ask this question that I was pushing just now a moment ago, because I think this is really perplexing. In what sense is cognition the truth of life? Right? In what sense is cognition, that account there, the truth of, and all the senses in which Hegel means that? It not only follows it, right, that's one claim, we know that one, but in the sense that it is the retrogressive grounding of that. What does that actually mean here? And as you'll see when you get there, the cognition is actually striving after two things, truth and goodness. So cognition looks like it's got what we would call broadly a epistemological aspect to it, truth, so knowledge in its sort of standard valence, but also it has a practical dimension to it. So how does that fit in with cognition? Do we have all of a sudden the will show up, or we somehow or another jump into Schopenhauer? What the hell happened, right? So we want to know how that chapter, perplexing as it is, relates to the life chapter to try to make sense of what's going on here at the end. And then we'll get to the methodology chapter after that. And then we'll finally end by looking at the preface to the 1831 edition that he wrote just before he died, the preface to this book one more time. Yep. All right, cool. I'll see you next week. Thanks.
Thank you.